Summer of Terror.
Well, it's got off to a pretty big start in that regard. As I've said on the Spectator website a number of times, you don't have to go back very many hours now to find the latest attack in Europe. And the accumulation of these attacks, I think, is going to have a very profound effect on European politics.
I mean, it's been shocking how many attacks there have been in the last few days. Is this just something Europeans are going to have to start getting used to, Harris?
This is the new reality. I mean, we've banged on about the global jihadist insurgency now for years, and largely on deaf ears. People didn't want to know, people wanted to look the other way, and this is the reality. This is the way life is going to be now for a while until we collectively get our act together and sort this problem out. There still seems to be a reluctance. I mean, I saw something in the news today that President Hollande has had a meeting with faith leaders. What's that going to do? Are they going to pray for peace? It's just, for me, I must admit, until the attack yesterday, even I, somebody who's been doing this for a number of years now, like Douglas, got a bit of jihadist terrorism fatigue. You know, an attack, okay, it's become the normal. But yesterday, what happened in Normandy really is for the first time in 12 years, and I'm afraid.
And is that because of the religious element to it?
For me, it's now it's the target, it's a selection of target. I mean, in the past, you know, there have been people from the Jewish traditions that have been targeted because they are politically Zionist, blah, 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 or whatever they want to go on about. Then they've picked on people they considered blasphemers, and then now they've actually declared a war on Christianity. This is the attack, the war on Rome that people like Baghdadi, Bin Laden...
And I mean, Hollande did refer to it as a war yesterday, didn't he? He
Yes.
said this is a war. How does that change things, Douglas?
Well, it doesn't change things because, I mean, he said that for a long time. And now, every time there is an attack in France, Hollande comes out and says there's a war. I think one of the most interesting things was, and going back to what you just asked Harris, was that the Prime Minister in France, Manuel Valls, said after Nice that France might have to get used to terrorism. And a lot of people reacted very badly to that statement. I thought it was, in some ways, refreshingly frank, because Valls is not wrong, that although you can limit the ability of people to get hold of Kalashnikovs and explosives, it's extremely hard to limit people's access to knives or trucks. And so you do have to warn the public, actually. You do have to tell them this is something which, apart from anything else, because there is a tendency always to turn on the people who are protecting us instead of the people attacking us. So you hear people criticizing the French authorities for not stopping Nice or not stopping Rouen. So there are always criticisms to be made. There are always what might have beens. But it is very hard, I say this in my cover piece, it is very hard to imagine a scenario where the church in Rouen yesterday could have been protected.
You know, one of the things that struck me recently, having travelled to France and having been around Central Europe, is that there is still this focus, rightly, on protecting and stopping terrorist attacks. As Douglas said, how do you stop a self-starter who has been remotely radicalised, who becomes remotely operationalised? How do you stop that person? Well, you've got to do whatever you can, of course. But at the end of the day, in Europe especially, they've been focusing on containment and stopping terrorist attacks. It's a bit like treating the symptoms. It's a bit like giving the penicillin to somebody who's got a disease. What about tackling the disease? When are we going to wake up and actually provide the inoculation and tackle the disease and cure people?
I mean, this is, Harris, right, it asks exactly the core question, but I have a very bleak piece of news on this, which is that it may not be possible for Europe to solve this problem. I say that for the following reasons. I mentioned this in the piece. The political leaders are aware of the problem of Islamism. They are very reluctant to say where Islamism comes from. The public, however, know where Islamism comes from. Islamism comes from Islam. Where does Islam come from? Islam comes most obviously from Muslims. So, how do you simultaneously argue that process which Germany in particular accelerated last year of importing millions of new Muslim arrivals into Europe is a wise thing to do at the same time that you have this problem already. And therein lies the political trap for our continent. Because obviously we have to keep the differentiation between ordinary Muslims who abhor such acts as Rouen yesterday and that minority that might find some sympathy, or that tiny minority who might do it. Yet at the same time, the more people who come into the continent who are of Muslim background, the more numbers will be vulnerable to that. And that is the problem, that we have to continue to exercise our judiciousness about this and not try to lump everyone into a basket, whilst admitting the Islamism comes from the Muslim community. And the French Prime Minister and the French President and no other European leader can solve that problem for Islam.
Yeah, it's essentially, there are people who are reluctant around the world to admit where the problem comes from. There are people who say this has got nothing to do with Islam, and then there are people that say this is all of Islam. The reality is, it has got something to do with Islam. The justification does come from, and we have to be honest, as Muslims, I'm a Muslim, we have to be honest and face up to that. The good news is that more and more Muslims are starting, but the bad news, it's not fast enough at this moment in time. There needs to be a reform, a process of reform within the Muslim traditions, going back to the old traditions of Islah and Ijtihad. That's a key component that's missing, and until our political leaders wake up to the fact that they need to empower and they need to put in place processes and strategies whereby this civil war that's taking place within Islam, because essentially this is what this is. This is not new. This has been going on for a while. It just raises its head in a different name. There's a civil war going on within Islam. Muslims need to sort it out. It's spilling over the streets. Muslims are being killed as well as non-Muslims. But going back to the point Douglas made, one of the things, fine, we're talking about migration, etc., but the majority of the people that have been carrying out these attacks in Europe are homegrown, people that are born in the region. Before we even start looking at what we do with people, whether we stop them coming in or not, that's a different discussion, we need to fix the problem at home. That's what we could not get into grips with.
But it isn't a different discussion. It is part of exactly the same discussion. Europe has not been able to assimilate the Muslims who have already come here. Some, yes, but a lot, no. So it is madness to, at the same time you have failed to assimilate the Muslims already here, bring in millions of more Muslims from the most war-striven parts of the world. It is madness. The Christians of the Middle East know how this plays out. They know how this plays out. Christians in France will be now learning how this plays out. And the numbers matter because, as I say, the most striking thing in this whole story is as follows. Islam is going through this long civil war. We don't know who wins. But Europe cannot put its own future, the European peoples cannot put our own future in the hands of that civil war. It's always been my belief that we have to, as much as we can, inoculate ourselves from this war. But we cannot, as Europeans, decide if the good Muslims do not win, then Europe dies, and this is not in our power.
Yes, Douglas has a point on, do we import more of this potential, let's say that a small percentage of the people that we take on as refugees, etc., maybe from this worldview. But the bigger danger is even before then. You go to Belgium, you go to Germany, you go to places like that. Not only are they, why I said immigration or refugee is a different conversation, before we even get to that, they're importing Salafi jihadi theology into their countries. You go to Brussels. Brussels has already said virtually to countries in the Middle East, here, have Islam in Brussels. And we're getting that kind of Islam already. So even without the immigrants and without the refugees, we're importing that aspect of religion already.
Absolutely, and that has to also be tackled. If they are serious about this, Europe's leaders, then they tackle that now as well. And now, but just one other point on this. I think that something which has not been borne in mind enough since the attack in Rouen is this. You'll remember that we started off with Harris mentioned the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January 2015. One of the the saddest responses to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which were almost unanimous in the abhorrence towards them. Pope Francis condemned attacks, of course, on Charlie Hebdo, but also said, he famously, if somebody insults my mother, they can expect a punch. Actually, from a man of God and a representative of what is meant to be a very peaceful religion, and whose founder certainly was very peaceful, this was a very retrograde comment. However, I'm not mentioning that to pick a fight, as it were, 18 months on. What I would suggest is this. 18 months now between the attacks on one of the most rollicking, joyously atheist, secularist magazines, perhaps the only one, anti-racist magazines in Europe, the epitome of free speech and liberté and so on. 18 months later, a French priest massacred at the altar by exactly the same ideology. This should be a moment, I would suggest, for Catholics, for secularists, for atheists, for liberal Muslims, for all sorts of people to come together and say, this is enough, and this is a very clear enemy. It kills the secularists of Charlie Hebdo, and it kills the priest during the Eucharist. What clearer sign could there be, and what greater coalition could you get to unite against this barbarism and snuff it out once and for all?
That was Douglas Murray and Haras Rafiq.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.